What I want to start with is the power, the country, the government that really has so many tentacles and is spreading so much negative influence throughout the region, and that is Iran.
I think it's very important for everyone to understand a couple of things. Number one, our current policy is not working. Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapons capability at a much faster rate than our sanctions policy is creating pressures on them to change behavior. More than half of the trade with Iran is done by European countries, Japan, and Australia. Russia and China have consistently undercut efforts at the Security Council to get tougher sanctions. I do believe there is a level of sanctions that could cause Iran to change its behavior. And the question is, and I think it'll be the challenge for the next administration, is what is the process by which we achieve the willingness of these countries to get those sanctions? No one thinks, I would hope that no one thinks simply talking to Iran because we want to be talking to Iran is going to produce what we want. You have to have a strategy. But right now, I don't believe we have a strategy that's working to achieve the goal that I think there's tremendous bipartisan consensus we need to achieve here. Iran cannot have nuclear weapons capability.
I'm of the view that there's no combination of inducements that will get them to give up nuclear weapons, because the nuclear weapons are worth more to them than the inducements. So if you want to get them to change their behavior, it isn't going to be the inducements that do it. It's going to be the sticks that focus their minds on what they stand to lose as they measure loss. Today, we are not doing that. Today, basically, the sanctions that have been applied by the Security Council don't touch the economy. Maybe you touch parts of the Revolutionary Guard, maybe you touch parts of the military, maybe you touch their nuclear industry, but you don't really touch their banks. You don't touch their commerce. You don't even touch the credit guarantees that European governments give to their companies to invest. If you want to convince the Iranians that they have to change their behavior, they have to see what they stand to lose. That's the context in which negotiations make sense. If you're going to talk about negotiations with Iran, don't go into negotiations with Iran with them thinking that they basically need it less than you do. We can't convey a message that somehow we're desperate for it, we need it more than they do. That doesn't mean you don't talk to them, but it means you create a context for the talks. And the context has to be one where they see very clearly the pressure is very real. The costs are not rhetorical costs. We don't threaten certain things and then not deliver on them. We make it clear what the costs are going to be. They begin to experience the costs. And in that context, you say, but there's also a way out. So in effect, what you're saying to them is, this isn't about humiliating you. This is about giving you a way out. But understand one thing. At the end of the day, you're going to have to make a choice. And the negotiations can only work if they realize they have to make a choice. Today, they don't think they have to make that choice.
I want to move to another flashpoint in the region, which is Lebanon. Lebanon really in Syria.
Well, I think what's happened to the Cedar Revolution is heartbreaking. I think that you have a situation in which a whole series of factors, including Israel's inability and willingness to do what was necessary in 2006 to fundamentally deal a blow to Hezbollah. The perception that Hezbollah, by surviving the war in that summer, won, I think has caused a real blow to Israel's credibility, to America's credibility in the region, because there is a sense there that Hezbollah was able to stand up to Israel. I think that America has also made mistakes over the course of the last several years. And I think that the extent to which Syria has felt that it could operate with impunity, at least until the Israeli airstrike to take out their nuclear plant, for which I think Israel should be congratulated. But I think the story of Lebanon tells you the extent to which everything in the region is intertwined. The perception of the United States in the Middle East matters hugely. And I think it's very important, as we are now in this election year, that the candidates take the right lessons from this administration. And in my view, this administration has gotten it right when we have been bold, when we have been decisive, when we have been focused, when we have used our military force when necessary. Where we have been less effective and less successful is when we have been unfortunately, not so bold, when we have not held Bashar Assad to account for the assassination of Rafiq Hariri, for the killing of American soldiers inside Iraq, for his support to Hezbollah, for the killing of Israelis that he has funded and supported through his support of Hezbollah. And I think that getting back to a situation where our enemies in the region understand that America will stand up for its friends, that America will stand up for its principles, and that we have red lines is critically important, because when those red lines aren't there, when our enemies like Iran and Syria begin to believe that they can act with impunity, you see situations like you've got in Lebanon today, where Hezbollah now has a veto over that government, where Hezbollah will be able, I fear, to significantly continue its efforts to rearm in southern Lebanon, continue to threaten Israel, and allow Iran a real chokehold on the region.
The Iranians are basically saying, along with Hezbollah and Hamas, that there is a different narrative now for this part of the world. Dating from the Madrid conference, there was a sense that when it comes to peace, there'll be peace and there'll be a two-state solution. Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas say no. You don't have to accept that narrative. So if Syria actually is not joining with them, it sends a message that maybe they don't think that this narrative is inevitable after all. But again, the real culprit in the end is Iran, far more than Syria. Syria becomes a conduit through which weapons go. The fact is, before the last war, Hezbollah had about 17,000 rockets. Now, after the war, maybe they were down to around 10,000 rockets. Today, they're somewhere between 30 and 40,000 rockets, even though there was a Security Council resolution that the administration touted very highly, 1701, in which they weren't supposed to be rearmed, but they were. Liz made the point about red lines. Well, that should have been a red line, but it wasn't. When the head of Israeli military intelligence says that they're capable of firing rockets from above the Litani and below the Litani, UNIFIL, the UNIFIL, which was supposed to be robust, big, 15,000 on the one hand, and then 15,000 from the Lebanese army, all deployed below the Litani River, and at least the one achievement was, even if you didn't prevent the rearming of Hezbollah, at least Hezbollah wouldn't have rockets below the Litani, and guess what? They now have rockets below the Litani. So if we're going to establish certain positions and we're not going to stand by them, we have a real fundamental problem. One of the senior members of the administration at one point said we stopped drawing red lines vis-a-vis Iran because they kept stepping over them. Well, I hate to tell you, then they weren't red lines. And at some point, if you're going to change the behavior of the Iranians, if you're going to change the behavior of the Syrians, if you're going to send a message to Hezbollah they have a lot to lose, when you establish a red line, it better be red and not pink.